Hello, and welcome to this session on using Ansible with Checkpoint APIs. I'm your host, Dwayne, and I appreciate you having me here today. In this episode, we will review your management server settings and make sure it is ready to accept connections from your Ansible host. We will review the Trusted Clients configuration, as well as make sure you have a dedicated administrator with the proper permissions. For the second half, I'll go over some helpful verification and troubleshooting items in case you're running into any troubles along the way. Grab yourself a snack, a beverage, and let's get started. First things first, we need to make sure the management server is ready to accept API commands from your soon-to-be Ansible host. To do that, we'll begin in Smart Console. However, we won't spend too much time here, so don't get too cozy. For those of you with multi-domain server, you'll need to connect to the MDS root domain in Smart Console. From there, everything else is the same as the single domain security management server that I have here in my lab. Speaking of which, here's my management server running RED 1.20 with Jumbo HFA 76. Select Managing Settings on the left navigation panel, and in the middle list select Blades. On the main window of options, you may have to scroll down a bit, but you're looking for the Management API section. Click the Advanced Settings button. Here you get three options. They might be self-explanatory, but we're going to review them real quick, just in case. The first option is Management Server Only. This means the API server will accept connections only from the management CLI command or some local script that runs on the management server directly. To do this, you have to log in to the management server with SSH first to run any of those local scripts. This won't work for Ansible, however, so you need to use one of the other two options instead. The best option is the second option, all IP addresses that can be used for GUI clients. If you're new to this party, GUI client is not something that is stuck in chewing gum. No. This is the original term for that which is now called Trusted Clients. A GUI client is just any host that can run Smart Console and connect to the management server remotely. But what does this have to do with Ansible? Ansible isn't running Smart Console. Well, that's because the management server, or the API server specifically, treats Ansible connections and any other remote API session as a trusted client. If your management server is a CloudGuard management, you might have the third option set, all IP addresses. You would use this because you can instead control access for Smart Console through an Azure, NSG, or an AWS VPC security group. For this demo, however, I'm going to leave it at all IP addresses. But you pick the right option for your management server environment and click OK. Notice when you make the change, it will only take effect after you publish the session. We'll do that in just a moment, but meanwhile, click OK at this message. If you chose the second option, then you have one more edit to make. In the middle at the top, select Permissions Administrators to expand that section and select Trusted Clients. If you installed a brand new management server, like I did here, then this is actually configured through the Gaia First Time Wizard. But for those of you with long-running management servers, upgrades, and migrations, then all those settings, of course, are retained. If you chose all IP addresses that can be used as GUI clients, then you need to add a trusted client entry here for the remote host where you'll be running your Ansible playbooks. Select the star button at the top menu and add a hostname and an IP address. No, you cannot use any of your existing objects for this. You have to make a whole new entry for the trusted clients list. One more pit stop and we'll be done here. Now select Permissions Administrators at the top to expand the tree if it's not already visible. I'm sure you know how to add administrators, but you should add one that is dedicated to Ansible only. For the Ansible administrator, there is one particular item I would like to call out and strongly encourage you to use. When you make your new administrator, instead of username and password, this time select API key. This makes it more like a service account of sorts. Why use an API key? Well, let's see what happens. So now select Generate API key and a nice long string generated for us. That may take a while for a password cracker to guess. By the way, for those of you who are particularly eagle-eyed, you may recognize this as a base 64 string, because that's exactly what it is. This is several dozen bits from the random generator and converted to base 64. More interesting, however, are the instructions that follow. Notice if you click OK here, you get no second chance to view this API key. Let's prove that point and click OK. Now look, the button says regenerate API key. I guess we have no choice because I didn't copy that key to my clipboard. Click the button, now copy that text for safekeeping. I have a handy dandy notepad already open, so I'll just paste it here for the time being. Be sure to add this to your password vault for safekeeping. Now let's give our API administrator some privileges. Set an appropriate permissions profile. I'm going to choose super user for this series. Even with Ansible, the administrator's permissions still applies just as it would with Smart Console. Similarly, for those of you with multi-domain, the same thing applies whether you're giving it permissions for a specific management domain or domain manager or global manager. It's the same permissions model everywhere, regardless of the connection method. Alright, now click OK to add our new API key administrator. Once you've made your selections and additions, now publish your changes. This is just a management server change, so no need for a policy install. Okay, now we're done with Smart Console and the setup of your management server. Good to go. Okay, if you like, you can pause here to have a bite of your snack, refill the beverage, whatever you like. When you're done, we'll come back here and talk about some hints, tips, and troubleshooting items that you might run into. If you took a pause, then welcome back. Now we'll go over those troubleshooting and verification items. Here we will look at the output of the API status command. I'll also show you the effects of changing your API service port, as well as some prerequisites that are easy to miss. At the end, I'll show where to find the API session log in case you need to call for help. With the fresh beverage in hand, let's dig in. For this, we'll switch to an SSH session to the management server. Here, I'm logged in with admin and went to expert mode. The command I'll use is API status. This is the #1 command I use when getting an overall quick check of the management server. This works the same on multi-domain as it does on the single domain security management server. There's a lot of good information in each of these sections, so we'll go through them one at a time. Starting at the top, we have the API settings. This section should look mighty familiar already. Accessibility means the valid IP addresses which can connect to the management server for both Smart Console and API sessions. Picking up where we left off, I had chosen all IP addresses on my lab server. This is what the accessibility line would look like with that selection enabled. Notice the line says require all granted. That makes sense. Now I will toggle the option to management server only and we'll see what that looks like. Notice now the line says require local. Different wording, but the same meaning. Now the management server will only accept API connections that originate from the management server directly, such as a local script or the management CLI command. I saved the most interesting one for last. I will toggle the option to all IP addresses that can be used for GUI clients. This option has two potential scenarios. We will take a look at the first scenario where you have a specific list of trusted clients defined. Now accessibility has two lines. Require local is the same as it was earlier. The management server must always accept API connections from itself. Otherwise, it gets rather lonely if it can't talk to itself. The second line shows the IP addresses of the trusted clients. In this example, I only have one specific client defined, and you can see its IP address on this line. In the second scenario, my API settings is still set to all IP addresses that can be used for GUI clients. In my trusted clients list, I still have my specific trusted client listed. However, I also have a trusted client defined with the special type any. Again, this is what you might use for a CloudGuard management. Now the accessibility line has reverted to require all granted. This situation only occurs if you have your API settings set to all IP addresses that can be used for GUI clients. When you have an entry with a special type any, it overrides everything you have in your trusted clients list, no matter how many trusted clients you have defined. This is an important distinction and a unique scenario I wanted to call to your attention. Keep these settings in mind as you are configuring your server and be on the lookout for these potential scenarios. Don't spend too much time troubleshooting the wrong thing if you notice something that seems unusual or out of place. Okay, so now your API settings are good. Without any of those things, Ansible would have had no chance of working. Moving down the list, we see the list of processes: API, CPM, FWM, and Apache. No surprise, but they all have to be in the started state. You can have the API in a stop state, yet much of your server will still function. It won't work well for many things, but your gateways can still connect, pull last known policy, and even send logs. So make sure the API service is started. Moving on down the list, look for the Apache Gaia port. You need to know if your server's local port was moved from the default or not. On a management server, this is set in Gaia with the command set web ssl-port. You need to know the port number so we can tell Ansible how to connect. If your port number is not 443 already, then take a note of that now. Here's an example of how you can change the port in Gaia using set web SSL port. Now run the command API status and you can see the port number has been changed. Run the command again to reset the port back to 443 and verify it again with API status. If you have the special situation of an older installation where you have an integrated management and gateway, then you will set this through Smart Console using the platform portal settings on the host object. Checkpoint doesn't sell this product anymore, but some customers still have this left over from earlier days. For those of you who have a management server behind another Checkpoint gateway, then make sure you have an access rule allowing your Ansible host to connect to your management server on this Apache port. Very important. You cannot do anything until that rule is in place. When we get to the Ansible setup, I'll show you a command you can use to test this connection before going further. Lastly, and by far the most important of them all here, API readiness test successful. Yes, you can have all the above items correct, including API in the started state, yet API readiness tests can fail. I've seen it, it happens, and there's a whole host of reasons as to why. Almost all of them are a TAC call to fix. Or better yet, call your local Checkpoint support partner, especially if they have a CCSM or CCTE on hand. You can stop and restart just the API server with the commands API stop and API start. You can see the readiness test fails when the API is stopped. You may have noticed earlier that the API server actually runs through the CPM process. Notice they have the same PID. Having some knowledge of this architecture will be helpful if you need to troubleshoot something in more detail. You can find a log of the API server in fwdir/log. You're looking for the file api.elg. This log contains a full transcript of all the API commands and internal API server operations. TAC, or your local Checkpoint support partner, will need this if you were to call for help on API issues. Okay, that's all for the management server setup. You're in good shape and ready to install Ansible. Be sure to hit that subscribe button below so you'll know when new content is available. Please click the thumbs up button and leave a comment to let me and others know how this video helped you. Be sure to tell your friends and share this with anyone you like. Join me in the next video and we'll start getting to the good stuff.